It has been a long 2 weeks, and it's going to all come to an end. Convention season, virtual convention season, tonight. The final night of the Republican National Convention, President Donald Trump himself is set to give a big address that will really start cementing what the Republican Party's message is going to be from now until November. I'm Emily. I hope you've been enjoying our coverage. Chris is gone. He claims to have been in meetings today, and he's very busy, so I am drinking his beer, and I think that's what he gets for abandoning the show on his final night of duty. But we will do without him, and frankly, there's more beer for me that way. Now, Donald Trump is set to speak alongside a slate of other high-profile Republicans. You've got Ben Carson, Mitch McConnell, Tom Cotton, Kevin McCarthy, Jeff Van Drew. You may remember Jeff Van Drew from switching parties from Democrat to Republican last year. This is an interesting person on the speaker list because he can really further and add depth to the message we've been seeing all week from the Republican Party, which is that the Democratic Party no longer serves the working class. It no longer serves black voters. And what they're trying to do is embolden people who feel uncomfortable in the Democratic Party to come on and to be more comfortable joining the Republican team, despite the way the media spins the GOP, spins conservatism, despite what Hollywood and celebrities might have to say about that. We've really seen a full effort on the part of the Republican Party to help bring those people over and make them feel more comfortable casting a ballot for Donald Trump. So you can expect Jeff Van Drew to give a story sort of like that this week. You know what? The Democrats also ran ads from former Republicans trying to get them to vote for Joe Biden last week. So we have both sides trying to say that their party no longer serves them and trying to get swing voters to come on over to the other side. Why is that? Well, it's for two reasons: the suburbs and the Rust Belt. There are a lot of Obama-Trump voters that people are looking for. People are looking to, Biden and Trump both want those Obama-Trump voters. Biden thinks he can get them back, and Trump thinks he can keep them, and maybe even add to his numbers. I mean, if you take what's happening in Kenosha right now, for example, not at all far from where I grew up, that's actually what Paul Ryan's district was for years. It had a major Chrysler plant until 1988. A lot of jobs right now in the storage industry. If you take what's happening in Kenosha, it's a really fascinating case study because we could see Kenosha acting as a bellwether for the state of Wisconsin, which is critical in November. What do you think the Obama-Trump voters in Kenosha are thinking about Joe Biden right now as their city is uprooted with violence and rioting? Donald Trump is making a play for using this recent violence to convince those voters they need to stick with him, because this will only get worse under Joe Biden, since he represents a party that has done a lot this summer to mainstream ideas about, quote, defunding the police, and they can tie the rioters and the violence to the left. So this is something that the Republicans believe helps them. And when you look at somewhere like Kenosha, where there are persuadable voters, independents who go for Obama, who go for Romney, and then go for Trump. And by the way, that district did go Obama, Romney, Trump, and Trump by a big margin. You see why Republicans want to touch on this messaging. Now, that's, of course, just talking about the electoral strategy behind the conversation about Kenosha, which is obviously downstream of the lives lost, the lives destroyed, and the businesses destroyed, and the pain that the community is suffering right now. We need to hear real solutions from Democrats and from Republicans. Joe Biden finally commented on it recently and condemned violence. But I think both parties are increasingly aware that this is something they need to address. We are going to certainly hear more about that from the Republican Party tonight. We're certainly going to hear more about it. Ben Carson, for instance, is speaking. I do wonder if he will address the racial strife. There have been a lot of speakers this week that talk about why Black Americans should feel comfortable casting their ballot for Donald Trump. And I'm curious to see how Ben Carson addresses that. Senator Tom Cotton, that will be an interesting speech. He's a name that's being thrown around a lot for a potential seat in 2024. And remember Tom Cotton, by the way, there's been a lot of conversation this convention about the media, which is so interesting because, usually a political party talks about healthcare, they talk about immigration, they talk about trade deals, and even if they don't have concrete solutions, it's at least the sort of policy arena. But this has been the culture war convention, as Chris and I have talked about all week, and as I wrote on the Federalist a couple of days ago. And the media is such a huge part of that because it's all about showing that coastal elites don't understand the middle of the country. And Tom Cotton wrote an op-ed that the New York Times ran and then backtracked on and fired a senior editor for having published. And I'm curious to see if Tom Cotton actually addresses that. It was alluded to in the so-called Harper's letter that went viral of kind of leftist media elites that basically condemned what the New York Times did. Now, this is the speaker, I think, this is like the Nicholas Sandmann and the McCloskey speaker of tonight. That is Ann Dorn, the widow of retired St. Louis police captain David Dorn, who was killed in June. She has a horrible, emotional, moving story to tell. That's the speaker I'm most looking forward to tonight. That's the speaker I think has the most potential of going viral and making headlines. Another speaker to watch out for, Alice Johnson. She is the person who was sentenced, she had a life sentence actually for drug charges that was commuted by Donald Trump after lobbying from Kim Kardashian. So again, when we talk about how this convention is really nudging the so-called realignment along purposefully, that's something that you can hear Alice Johnson speak to. That's something you'll hear Jeff Van Drew speak to. Ivanka Trump is speaking tonight. Ivanka is a good speaker. It'll be so. I thought Tiffany Trump just gave an okay speech. I thought it was kind of a throwaway line. I don't want to make too much of it, but when Tiffany Trump spoke a couple of nights ago, she sort of said with a smile on her face that she can relate to people who are looking for jobs right now because she just graduated from law school. I don't really think that's a funny joke because there are people who actually have to worry about what will happen to their families and their livelihoods and their abilities to feed themselves if they miss a paycheck, and that's not really a concern for Tiffany Trump. But Ivanka Trump is the daughter of a billionaire who now faces the task, like her brothers did earlier this week, of addressing a country suffering financially. And that is tired of elites. And Ivanka's a really interesting figure in the Trump family because where someone like Don Jr. can kind of talk about hunters and fishers because he's one of them, as we mentioned on the show a couple of days ago, Ivanka Trump really does come across as more of the daughter of a billionaire. I think she's a very capable public speaker. I think she's likable if you're not somebody who has a deep hatred of Donald Trump. I think Ivanka comes across as a likable person. She's very articulate. And she's very aware. She's very self-aware, I should say. And so I doubt we'll see any of those kind of lines that Tiffany Trump had the other night. But I'm curious to see what Ivanka Trump speaks about. She's somebody who was instrumental in the passing of the child tax credit in the tax bill, but at the same time, in the tax reform bill a couple of years ago. But at the same time, this has not been a convention that has harped on economics. This has been a convention that has, when it does touch on economics, it's often been in a sort of culture war way. And so that's going to be something I'm curious about, how Ivanka addresses it. Is she going to talk about the media? I think she's going to talk a lot about her father as a father and as a person. That's something both conventions, of course, have done a lot of. Joe Biden's character was talked up constantly in the Democratic National Convention, and there's been a lot of that with Donald Trump. A lot of family has spoken. Melania, Eric, Don Jr., Tiffany all addressed that. People like Jim Jordan have addressed that. So I expect we'll hear a good amount of that from Ivanka herself. Franklin Graham is speaking. Rudy is speaking. So I think we can expect that to be pretty lit, to say the least. Actually, the president of the Ultimate Fighting Championship is speaking. So it's going to be another exciting night. We'll see if there are more surprises in store for us. This has also definitely been a reality television convention, and I mean that in a good way. When you have the challenge of, really not being able to have the excitement that large crowds bring, which we learned from, I think, the Democratic National Convention, how much excitement large crowds can bring. When somebody is speaking to an empty room, Joe Biden or Kamala Harris, the speech can be good, but it's the words are ringing out into this giant open space and you're getting no live reaction. Whereas the RNC totally had the benefit of going after the DNC and realizing how essential that live component was. And I think it's really made a huge difference. Last night's speech by Mike Pence, I think, benefited enormously, not just from that very smart backdrop of Fort McHenry, but also from the live audience that they were able to bring in. Tonight's live audience is going to be even larger. It's going to be 1,500 people. That's going to bring a lot of energy to Donald Trump's speech, and it's going to be kind of like a rally, which if we haven't seen a rally since the Tulsa rally, and I think a lot of people in the president's circles are eager for him to get back to that kind of format. Now, as far as the content of his speech goes, I expect it to be not a so-called American carnage speech, which we saw from the president in a couple of stops last week. He went to Minnesota, for instance, during the DNC and gave some speeches. I kind of expect him to come across with a more uplifting tone. I think Republicans believe that the American people want to feel good about their country right now. And that's maybe not true of the American people as a whole, but I think they realize that it's probably smart on an electoral level when you're the incumbent to tap into that group of people that wants to feel good about the country. And I think it's also important to remember, I'm here in Washington, D.C. I'm on a coast. I think it's so important for journalists to check their bias, since most of them are on the coast. They don't realize there are pockets of this country that haven't experienced large COVID outbreaks, but they have experienced large COVID shutdowns, and they've seen their local businesses suffer and close up shop in some cases. And when they don't have these large outbreaks, that's frustrating. I mean, they've been stuck in their houses, their kids are home from school, and they haven't seen the sort of medical impact of the disease. And so when you're thinking about people in the middle of the country who might be friendly to Republicans anyway and are listening to these conventions, and by the way, the ratings for the Republican convention have gone up. They're closer to where the Democrats were. The DNC had higher ratings on average last week, but the Republican ratings continue to creep up. I think that's because the president is putting on a good show, and he does have surprises in store for everybody, from that naturalization ceremony. We saw Madison Cawthorn stand out of his wheelchair last night. It's just, he's had these sort of surprising elements that people don't expect to happen, and that is what makes people tune in, frankly. Personally, I am tuning in not only because it's my job, but primarily because of the Kimberly Guilfoyle speech, which made me laugh so hard. But that actually gets to the point of what I'm talking about. I mean, it was just phenomenal. She's so used to speaking to that live crowd that when she is, and by the way, I should absolutely note that there have been many speeches where Republicans are speaking just to the camera and to a largely empty room, but they haven't had a situation like where Joe Biden and Kamala Harris were giving these like big keynote addresses to empty rooms where the cameras are purposefully sort of catching the largeness of the space. Republicans have very much been sort of a made for TV speech where they're, tight shots, focused on the camera, and then we get these shots of the stage, and people sort of coming in and out and in and out. It's less kind of jumping around, and it makes it seem like people are really in the same space. And I think this worked pretty well. I was worried on the first night that it was going to be incredibly hard to watch because it would just be so boring when you have a single person staring into a camera and cycling in and out. But they've kept the speeches pretty short. They have a lot of speakers. I think both the DNC and the RNC have tried to feature average speakers. I think when like your everyday people, the lobsterman, the father whose daughter was killed in the Parkland shooting, Andrew Pollock, and I think the DNC tried to do that as well with DACA recipients and gun violence victims. But, the DNC did it in these, what I continue to say, really are overproduced videos that look and feel like political ads, where the Republicans had these people give speeches themselves. And the Republicans, by the way, have the added benefit of not relying on Hollywood hosts at all to distract from the kind of everyday people that they have up there. You're not going to have a viral moment from Julia Louis-Dreyfus that might overshadow the normal person you had come in and give a speech. So I think that's been good for the RNC. I think they've benefited from that. But I think when we're looking at Kimberly Guilfoyle, which one of the lines that she shouted so loudly, because again, she's used to speaking to a Trump rally, like a massive crowd, she said, "The best is yet to come." And that's what I mean about the RNC trying to strike this upbeat and glass half full tone. And the DNC tried to do that too. And again, this is because they know they're going for the Rust Belt and they're going for the suburbs. And when the DNC is going for the suburbs, that's why they were talking about gun control and they were talking about Biden's character and his compassion. And when the RNC is speaking to the suburbs, they are speaking to that sort of like they've also focused on the average, the aspect of like the everyday person in the Trump presidency who's benefited from, for instance, maybe the child tax credit that Ivanka Trump is going to speak about tonight. So these conventions have really had to balance that, but I think they have been focused on that. Absolutely, those two key demographics coming up in November. The messaging from here on out, from the convention forward, is going to be so heavily focused on those two groups. Democrats, of course, need turnout in urban areas. I think they're less worried about getting that with Joe Biden than they were with Hillary Clinton. But, they can't have Obama voters staying home in large cities because they are disillusioned or disenfranchised. I think the Trump campaign is going to maybe encourage people to vote, is going to try to convince, particularly this convention has had so many Black Americans talk about why they are voting for Donald Trump. And I think that's a part of why Republicans are focusing so heavily on the demographic. But I also think this convention has been the coming out party for the new Republican Party. That's really, at the end of the day, what it is like in the middle of potentially 2 terms of Donald Trump, or at the end of one term of Donald Trump. Here is the emergent GOP. Here's what has happened in this sort of reshaping, Trump era reshaping. And we've seen, Abby Johnson on the stage talking about the, quote, smell of abortion. That is just not something that the Republican establishment would have ever allowed on that stage. They would have thought that it would be uncouth and sort of a part of that dirty culture war that they don't really want anything to do with unless it can win them votes in some sort of campaign here or there or primary here or there. It was a remarkable moment. And part of how this RNC has been the coming out party for the new Republican Party. Of course, I would argue that Trump has changed the party for the good, but also for the bad. But this convention has done a good job showcasing the improvements to the party. And I think particularly as somebody who follows cultural issues really closely, it's been evidence that the Republican establishment is starting to understand the populist appeal of culture war issues. And that's, they may be focusing on them for cynical reasons, but they are focusing on them, and that's a start. So I think we can expect to see more of that tonight, but it's been a very long and very interesting 2 weeks. Of course, it's been virtual, so it hasn't been the sort of usual dog and pony show in-person conventions where, journalists are taken to drinks by like lobbyists, and the lobbyists are converging on the party, and the party is courting the journalists, and oh my gosh, these things are just exhausting, not only because they go from 7 a.m. until 1 a.m. That's the least exhausting part of it. The most exhausting part of it is watching the sort of swamp creatures on both sides of the aisle mingle with one another. But the virtual convention has eliminated some elements of that, and I think as the Democratic National Convention was, as the week wore on, it got better. They realized that it would be smart to have a fireworks show, for instance, and they tried to incorporate more live elements. Joe Biden's granddaughter surprising him. That kind of thing. They tried to, they had Julia Louis-Dreyfus throwing off to Andrew Yang. So they tried to do more of it. I don't think it was as bad as it could have been. They avoided a lot of major dramatic snafus, but Republicans, and I don't know if all of this is attributable to the fact that they had the benefit of going second. I think some of it, frankly, is just because Donald Trump knows how to make good television, and I imagine he exerted a lot of control over the production of this convention. And so that's a big part of it. But it's been a long 2 weeks. It's going to be a long, 68 days from now until the election. It's such a short amount of time. But in these news cycles and in this moment in our culture, it does seem to just drag on because we deal with more tragedy and national pain, it seems, every single week. So it'll be one of those things that goes both slowly and quickly. That's, I guess, just how life is sometimes. But please subscribe. Hope you've been enjoying our content. We're trying to put so much more of it out on YouTube, and we hope that you'll stay tuned for some of it. Enjoy the show tonight, everyone.